Well, for the last 3 weeks, we've been in a series about women called the Daughters of Eve. We've been addressing some of the misconceptions about what the Bible has to say about women, particularly those that have been used to support patriarchy. Patriarchy, by the way, literally means rule by fathers, but it's used as a term for social systems and cultural conventions that favor men. Now, next week, I will not be in worship, so we will be concluding this series 2 weeks from today. And so this is the second to last sermon delivered by me in this series, but appropriately in a series called Women, your preacher next week will be a woman most of you know, a lady by the name of Dr. Diane Wells. But back to this sermon this morning. Back on the first week of this series, we established that the patriarchy, this emphasis on men, is not the natural state of things when we look at the early chapters of Genesis. We looked at that a few weeks ago. In the first account of creation, you may recall, this is how the creation of human beings is described. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in numbers, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." So human beings, both male and female, are made in the image of God. Both are together commanded to fill the earth and rule over it. And we know God's not just talking to the man, because there's no way he can be fruitful or fill the earth on his own unless there's something you know that I don't. And in the second account of creation, the woman is created after the man to provide him with, quote, a suitable helper. Now, we might be tempted to think of the woman as nothing more than an afterthought or a complement to the man. But we could just as easily conclude that she was in fact an improvement on him, just as he was an improvement on the animals. And by the way, rarely in Genesis does God favor anyone for being first. It's usually the second son in Genesis, for instance, who receives God's blessing. Furthermore, suitable helper doesn't mean servant. It doesn't mean assistant. The word for helper is often used of God in the Old Testament. So this word doesn't inherently mean someone who is subordinate. And the word suitable implies that she is like him. She is his equal. The animals weren't suitable helpers because they weren't on his level, but the woman was. There is no hierarchy in this first marriage. The man and the woman were part of a mutually beneficial partnership. So then where, besides the patriarchy, do we get the idea that the woman must submit to the man and the man is the head of the household? Well, we get it from these scriptures that are frequently taken out of context. First of all, from 1 Corinthians 11:3, the head of the woman is man, and from Ephesians 5:22, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Now, people look at these statements and they figure that settles it, especially people who are comfortable with or who benefit from patriarchy. Now, these two verses appear in Paul's writings. And those who are offended by these statements often try to discredit Paul or to suggest that these are not original to Paul's writing. Now, I'm here to tell you that there is more to these statements than there appears to be. They do not, in fact, support patriarchy, and I can demonstrate that without discrediting Paul and without slicing and dicing the Bible. First of all, let me show you a couple of other things that Paul said about men and women. In his letter to the churches in the region of Galatia, he wrote this: "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." In Paul's thinking, Jesus breaks down the hierarchies that we create for ourselves, including putting women in a position subordinate to men. And here's something else from his letter to the church in the city of Corinth. By the way, this is the same letter that infamously refers to the husband as the head of the wife. He writes, "The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife." Now that last sentence would have been considered very progressive in Paul's time. That doesn't look like unilateral submission to me. That doesn't look like the wife is to submit to the husband and not the other way around. What this looks like is mutual submission. The wife doesn't just yield to her husband, they yield to each other. That is how Paul really thinks a marriage should work. And it should remind us of what we discovered already in Genesis. What the gospel is doing is restoring the world to the way things ought to be, and that includes the relationship between the sexes. Now let's look at those eyebrow-raising passages. The first one appears again in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which is part of a larger section about keeping worship orderly rather than chaotic. In this particular passage, Paul is trying to make the case for women wearing head coverings of some kind when they perform a sacred action in church, like praying or prophesying. In that culture, it was apparently a sign of respect or honor for a woman to cover her head, and Paul was trying to encourage the Christian women in Corinth to stick with that cultural convention. Here's how he makes the case. "I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels." Well, so far it certainly seems like Paul is being sexist here. It seems as though he's contradicting his earlier statement that suggests mutual submission in marriage. But keep in mind, that's not really his point here. He's just trying to convince these women to stick to the cultural practice of covering their heads. That's what this passage is about. Also, we should note that the word for head also means source or origin. Calling the man the head of the woman is a reference to the creation story. Remember, she was made from his rib. Her source, her origin, came from the man in the creation story. And so in that sense, he is her head or her source. But here's the thing. Even Paul seems to have realized that he was coming off as sexist. Have you ever pursued a line of reasoning or argumentation and suddenly realized that you were in fact arguing against your own beliefs? Maybe you argue against something so fiercely that it eventually looks like you're arguing for the opposite extreme, and you don't agree with that either. Well, that seems to happen to Paul at this point. And he was writing in ink, no backspace, no eraser. So instead of going back and getting rid of all of the stuff he just wrote, he backtracks a little bit. He tries to qualify everything he said so far with what he says next. He says, "Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. But everything for as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. but everything comes from God, which, by the way, was his whole point in this whole passage. Lest any of his male readers use his statements about men as the head or the source of women to advocate patriarchy, Paul reminds them that women are also the head or the source of men. They all have mothers. He reemphasizes in this very same passage that men and women are to be interdependent and mutually submissive. By the way, Paul rambles on for about 3 more verses about this head covering thing before finally saying, if anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God, which basically means I put my foot in my mouth debating this issue, I'm done arguing about it. But that's what's really going on in this passage, folks. Paul is arguing for a certain way to worship. He realizes that by arguing this certain style of worship, he eventually sounds like he's going against his own beliefs about women. And so he backtracks to make sure his audience know that that's not what he's trying to say. So that's the first of these 2 statements. Let's look at the second one now. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Now, the first thing I want to point out is this. In the original Greek, the word submit only appears in that first sentence. It does not appear in the second one. A more literal translation would be submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, to your own husbands as you do to your Lord. That first sentence is the beginning, the thesis statement, if you will, of everything that follows from Ephesians 5:22 to Ephesians 6:9. Paul commands his readers to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he tells them what that looks like in culturally appropriate ways. For wives in a patriarchal culture, that meant showing respect for their husbands. But Paul isn't done. He has more to say about what it looks like to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Remember, Paul has already established that he believes marriage to be a mutually submissive, mutually beneficial relationship, not a unilaterally submissive one. So he explains what it looks like for the husband to submit to his wife. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Friends, what Paul is describing here is not a unilaterally submissive marriage, but a mutually submissive one. One in which both the man and the woman are looking out for each other's dignity and well-being, even if that means making personal sacrifices. Paul goes on to describe what mutual submission looks like in other relationships, parents and children, slaves and masters. But the whole passage is about mutual submission in relationships where one clearly had more social power than the other in Paul's time and place. But that does not mean that Paul is endorsing those social hierarchies. We certainly don't believe that Paul was advocating slavery. Why do we believe he was advocating patriarchy? He was merely addressing the matter of mutual submission in the social context of his day. Friends, we live in a very different world than Paul lived in. We have learned as a society that women can do anything men can do. We have learned that women have been grossly underestimated. Heather and I saw a movie last weekend called The Hustle. Anne Hathaway plays an accomplished con artist who coaches a less experienced Rebel Wilson in the art of swindling wealthy men. She says that the reason women have an advantage in conning men is that men always assume they are smarter than women. Something that we should know by now is patent nonsense. Unfortunately, we men haven't realized that yet, otherwise there wouldn't be such a thing as mansplaining. Mansplaining, if you're unfamiliar with the term, refers to when a man gives unsolicited advice to a woman he assumes doesn't know as much as he does. As much of a feminist as I consider myself, even I'm guilty of this one, just ask my wife. But friends, hopefully you and I know that women can do anything that men can do. We began to realize it during the Second World War when women entered into the workforce. Remember Rosie the Riveter? Then came the 1950s, a season when women were pushed back into the house. The 1983 movie A Christmas Story takes place in 1940, but the plight of Ralphie's mother reminds me of what I picture moms in the 1950s experienced. She serves her husband and two boys dinner. She finally sits down. She puts her fork to her mouth. And then her husband, who's reading the paper the whole time, asks her for a second helping. She sets her fork down, gets up, gets her husband some more food. And as she returns to her seat at the table, her oldest son asks her for more milk. Ralphie's voiceover says, "My mother had not had a hot meal for herself in 15 years. That's what I imagine the 50s being like for women. And then finally, the 1960s came when women began challenging the patriarchy. Women in this country began showing the world what they were capable of. Unfortunately, men were slow to catch up. Even as it became the norm for women to work outside of the home, bizarrely, they were still seen as the chief caretakers of children. Thankfully, fathers have begun sharing more of the responsibility in caring for young children. It's odd to most in my generation, by the way, to hear older men we know to be fathers say they've never changed a diaper. I've probably changed more than my wife by now, although that's probably more than fair. Hey, listen to the rest of what I have to say. That's probably more than fair considering what Heather went through giving birth to them. Speaking of when the boys were born, when Charlie was born, I took a 2-week paternity leave. The United Methodist Book of Discipline allows for up to 8 weeks of paid parental leave, and in retrospect, I probably should have taken more. That's another thing that might seem odd, but think about it for a minute. It is becoming more common for men to take paternity leaves after their wives give birth. Why? Because the whole family has to adjust, not just the mother. And it's not right to expect the mother to suffer through those first weeks by herself. It's not right. So these sorts of changes are good things. They are signs that things are getting more fair, more equal. We're starting to see men and women as equal partners again, just as it was in Genesis. But there are still echoes of the patriarchy under the surface. When we as a culture see a father with children acting up in public, we might feel sympathy or pity for him. But when we see a mother with children acting up, we might think she's a bad mom. Friends, the patriarchy has done a number on us all. And it is a tragedy, an absolute tragedy, that the sacred scriptures have been irresponsibly used and God's name vainly invoked to support it. Women have put up with unfair wages, unfair standards, inappropriate behavior in the workplace, various forms of spousal abuse, and disproportionate workloads both at work and at home. And these scriptures have been misused to endorse these injustices. Our God is a God of justice. Jesus calls his church to be a people who stand up for the abused, the mistreated, and the oppressed. And friends, no group of people has been more consistently and perpetually and systematically oppressed than women. God have mercy on us.